Welcome to From Thinking to Inking, Episode 1, Part 2. In this episode, I'm talking to Miss Mitchell about her story from a broad perspective, the road that led to this draft, larger changes, character development, world building, etc. And that all leads up to the first chapter of the novel. So, one slight note that I need to give just to save face. At one point, I have a massive brain fart and refer to Titanio for some reason, and even though that's not even a character in Midsummer Night's Dream. I know that it's Oberon. I didn't even have to look it up. I knew that later. So please just don't give me hate mail.
All right, so let's get down to the nitty gritty. So you said that you kind of referenced it. So your kernel idea wasn't really a sentence so much as scratching an itch of you love Beauty and the Beast and nobody had done it. Nobody had focused on the cursor, and only one person had done the gender swap, and you just wanted to look into that.
Yeah, and I'm sure that there were other gender swapped Beauty and the Beast stories that I wasn't aware of at the time, but
Mm,
I had read a lot of them and only found one. And so I was like, that's probably a really good idea, and it was one that I was interested in. Yeah, and then also exploring, this witch or wizard or fairy who caused all the trouble in the first place, and kind of making them a bigger character. Those were the two motivations behind starting this novel. And I Yeah, that was really it. And it was a very conscious decision of, it wasn't like I had this idea and, oh, I got to start writing it down before I forget it. It was very much I'm going to write a book. I want it to fulfill these things.
mm.
And once I had figured out what those things were, I just got started. And it came together fairly quickly, all things considered, even though, I was working on it during my senior year of college, which was a pretty busy time. But I didn't, I ended up, most of the revisions I did actually came after I got my agent, because he, worked on it a bit and put it through the ringer.
Is that
So
after you self published it, or
it had gone online, but I hadn't really done anything with it. So when I got my agent, I took it, and I actually, the first book that the book that got my agent essentially was my other novel, Roaring Boys, which is a Peter Pan story. That was the book, I'd already finished Shifted, put it aside, and when I finished Roaring Boys and started sending it out, that was when um, I got a response of, please send more, please send the whole book. I want to work with you. And so when that happened, I shifted offline, because, he was interested in both Roaring Boys and Shifted, and seeing, if what he could do with those. And so once he had kind of exhausted his contacts and his um, uh, different publishing houses that he thought they would be good fits for. We discussed it, and he was like, you could always just leave them to the side, because, once we get a publishing deal, a lot of houses might be interested then in taking these other titles. And then you've got a backlog of stories you can sell, or you could self publish them. So I decided to self publish Shifted and Roaring Boys, but we're sitting on the other three, that I've written since then. And maybe eventually they will be self-published. Maybe they'll get traditionally published. I kind of have a combination there. Um, yeah, so Shifted did have some revisions and edits before it officially was self-published in its final form. Um,
so you had that idea? You sat down, you started thinking about it. So what
mhm.
were the first the earliest ideas that you had of how to do the story? Um,
Well, usually, one of my processes for any of my books, but this being the inaugural book that I tried, it was picking a time period and a setting. Um, and the Beauty and the Beast is I think fits so well in a European 18th, 19th century setting. Um, so I knew that I wanted it to be English ish. I never name exactly where it is. And I knew that I wanted it to be um, kind of 1800s ish. I mean, there's a reference to the Civil War at some point. Um,
Yeah, which was
you
I
know,
thought was a very clever way of letting people know when the setting was without ever actually saying it.
yeah, yeah. I was quite chuffed with that myself. So yeah, that was a bit of a way to ground people and feel, oh, okay, that's where they are, without ever really saying this happens in Bristol in 1852 or whatever. Um, I picked the setting, I picked the time period, and then I just started. There were certain elements that I wanted, my main characters to have. Obviously, there's a lot of connection to books. The library in Beauty and the Beast, in the Enchanted Palace, has always been a huge, huge source of inspiration for me. I want a library someday with rolly ladders. That's just a thing. Maybe I'll only have one ladder, but it better roll, and someday I want that. And so having the main character, Lewis, be a printer's apprentice, was a good way to kind of tie in a connection to uh, a library at some point, some way for him to relate to this beast character. Um,
So was
and
that was
mhm.
that just part of the story for you, or was that like an almost intentional way to connect it to the Disney version of Beauty and the Beast because reading and everything was so important to
That was
Belle?
that was just a story portion of it. I have to say, I've not I don't remember the last time I've seen the Disney Beauty and the Beast. I am not an enormous fan of Disney just because I don't like musicals. Um, I liked Tangled. That was a pretty good one.
Oh, that one's
And
great. I think
oh,
it's incredibly underrated.
I think it is the best myself. And
It's my
um,
brother's favorite, actually.
it's good. It's really good. The characters are so fantastic, and the take on the story is a really really unique one. So yeah, the library and the books and the printing had nothing to do with Disney, and more to do with my favorite. Robin McKinley's book, the heroine is also kind of a bookish girl. She's not beautiful. She's named Beauty, but she finds that very ironic. I relate to that character. I've always been bookish myself and not particularly confident, and I wanted to capture that in a male perspective as best as I could. Obviously, with the understanding that I'm not a guy, so I got to do some imagining here, of what that might look like, and that's where the matchmaking aunt came in. Um, he's a very handsome bachelor, and she wants to marry him off, but he's just not interested. He wants to read his books and be left alone, and so that was kind of a for me that was a joke, that the beauty character is kind of traditionally either not very beautiful or really beautiful but not your typical example of femininity, and I wanted Lewis to be this handsome catch, but at the same time, he's not very confident. He's got other problems to deal with, and that makes him kind of uh, a similar character to the Beast, who is physically um, terrifying and hideous and unconfident for those reasons. Um, and so they kind of come to this relationship from kind of opposite sides of the same coin, of feeling like not ready for a relationship, unworthy of a relationship, and then they start falling in love with each other without even really realizing it at first.
That was the character that you wanted for the male version of Belle.
Hmm.
um,
Yeah.
how did you get to the? How did you end up with the character of Robin and Eyeless and how did you pronounce her husband's name?
Mitis.
Mitis. Okay.
Yeah, I yet again I don't those are Gaelic names, and
Yeah,
I'm
I
not
knew that, and
entirely
that gave me
I'm
no
not
confidence in how to pronounce it because I was like, I don't.
Right.
they do weird things with letters.
They do, and I'm not 100% sure that that is the exact way to pronounce those names. That's just what's always been in my head, so I've stuck with it.
Okay.
I've always also been, you know, kind of on the skeptical side whenever an author, and Christopher Paolini did this, and I even did this with my initial fantasy novel where they put a pronunciation guide in the back, because as
I
a
don't know how to read
reader,
those.
yeah, well, for me, when I'm as a reader, I that's the last thing I get to, and by that point, my mind has already decided this is how it sounds. And so being told you're wrong, it's different, not gonna have any influence on me. I'm a stubborn person.
And what does an
So
upside down
I
E mean anyway?
Yeah, there's an umlaut, and I don't know what that's supposed to say. So I kind of, I will never be offended if somebody pronounces a name differently than I do because you take away from stories things that the author didn't intend, and I think that's part of the magic of reading. So to me, I pronounce it Eyeless and Mitis, but other people can do whatever they want with them. But for Robin, so when I first started writing, kind of a sub thing that I did in my head is I wanted um, to put little Shakespearean jokes or references to other fairy tales in there. So Robin Mathden, Robin Goodfellow, that's the actual translation of his last name. He's Puck, from A Midsummer Night's Dream.
Yeah, I
Um,
did actually like something you said made me think of Puck. I cannot remember what
yeah,
it
I
was, but
actually used the name at one point when Eyeless is
yeah,
is
that's right. She calls
telling
him Puck. I was like,
Lewis,
oh, he is kind of like Puck.
yeah, who he is. And one of the things that I love particularly about fairy tales are the traditional fairy tales, not the Disney ones where the fairies are cute and sweet and they help you, win the day, but the scary ones, especially Irish fairy tales. I have a couple of collections of Irish fairy tales that my dad brought me from Ireland. He's a pilot, so he flies all over. Um, and oh my gosh, they're terrifying. Um,
Yeah, the
and so
Jonathan Strange,
Robin,
Mr. Norrell.
yeah, yeah, very much the don't step in a circle of mushrooms, you don't know where you'll go, type thing, and where everything they say has a second meaning, and you just really got to be careful. So that's the kind of fairy that I really enjoy the story of, and I've always wanted somebody to portray Puck in a play, or from the Shakespeare's play, or in a story with that kind of menace. There are some things in his speeches that are very scary, and people usually play him as kind of foppish or lighthearted. And there's literary evidence for that in some of his speeches, but there's also a menace there that I've always wanted to see brought forth. And so that
There,
was kind of
there's some hints that Titania's keeping him in check.
Yeah, yeah, very much so. And so I wanted Robin to have this sense of mischief gone awry, especially, if he's the one who did the curse, I had to figure out his motive behind that. It had to be sufficient enough um, to cause something so horrible and keep him engaged and, uh, you know, uh, acidic about it for years, centuries. And so that's where the idea of, kind of a Braveheart type thing, the love of your life gets killed for something that they didn't do. And he was prevented by the law of the forest, Midas. He's kind of a Green Man character for me. Um, and so he wasn't able to get the revenge he wanted, and this was as good as he could get. So he's still very bitter and very angry, and he can't tear himself away. So his menace, his level of um, just eeriness came very much from Irish fairy tales and the kind of creatures that inhabit those stories. Um, and Eyeless and Mitis, if I'm gonna give it all away, Eyeless is kind of me. Or how I imagine myself if I wasn't a fairy tale. The barefoot wild woman running through the woods with a bunch of dogs. That's my ideal. And uh, they also kind of relate back to a couple of other story characters who I really enjoyed. There's an author I love named Tamara Pierce, who wrote a whole bunch of lady knights and female warriors and sword and sorcery type books. And some of my favorites follow a couple of characters where there's a girl named Dane and a mage named Numair, and they have wild magic, and they can talk to animals, and they can shapeshift, and they have these incredible adventures. So that kind of duo relationship has a lot of meaning for me, and so um, having them kind of be the the side for good of the fairy realm, I think provided a nice balance against Robin, who is alone. He's the broken side of that. His partner is gone, and he's left a half person as a result, and all he can do is try to break the things around him as a means of revenge. Um, so that's kind of where that trio came from, and they were also a matter of just kind of discovering as I went along, um, uh, how it went with the story, and where they kind of came into it.
So
So
why did you decide that you needed Eyeless and Midas as a counter? Why did you think that you needed the good side of the fairies to be present?
for me, it was a matter of, once the Beauty and Beast character are trapped in the palace, there's not really any way to know what's going on in the outside world. And so I wanted, I also didn't want it to just be, the humans against the evil fairy. That's kind of traditional. That's uh, something that is more in keeping with the old story, even though we don't get very much of the evil fairy. Uh, it's they're fighting the curse. They're fighting on their own. So I wanted to have, a man on the outside, as it were. Um, so while Lewis is in this enchanted manor trying to figure out how to break the curse, there's stuff going on outside at the same time. The world hasn't stopped. And so for Eyeless, it's going and trying to find her husband. And one of the things that uh, I've always, in as well as trying to figure out, what happened with the one who cursed um, the Beast character in the first place. Many Beauty and the Beast story kind of get stuck in the bubble of the palace or the manor, and you don't really know what's going on outside. Part of that is because you're dealing with the perspective of the Beauty character, and then you've got the magic mirror that allows them to see outside. Um, but I've always kind of wanted more. I've always wanted to know what is happening. Is there more that's going on? And since um, my Robin character obviously is still at play, I felt like there needed to be something that would make things difficult for him. So I mean, because there are laws of magic, and I mentioned those very briefly, where he has to allow somebody to try to break it. That's the cost of the spell. But he's a wily guy. He could find ways to get around it, and if he's not kept in check or fought against by someone, it's not going to be Lewis, the Beauty character, or the Beast character, because they're stuck. They got their own stuff going on. So it had to be somebody else, and it had to be somebody on his level. Um, in the fairy realm, because he plays behind the scenes mostly. Um, so that's kind of where I wanted that balance. Um, somebody, you've got Lewis and Bree on one end, and then you've got Robin and the good fairies on the other. So
Why did you decide to make Eyeless a human as opposed to another fairy?
well, she kind of is both. Her history is that she was human, and then fell in love with this minstrel at a fair, and uh, ended up, marrying him and receiving part of his power, which made her no longer human. Um, and there's There's a bit of boy. I'm trying to think of the good examples of this. There's some mythology behind that, either half humans in Greek and Roman mythology, or other, Irish fairy tales of people who have been fairy touched and all of a sudden have a longer lifespan or different powers. So I wanted her to kind of be the go-between, where she used to be human, she knows what it means to be human, but she also has an insight into this other world and has been alive for centuries and has a limited amount of power herself. Um, but at the end, you really do see some of her more human side when she's observing this final fight between Midas and Robin, where she feels very much like, a child among titans, because these guys are, she may be no longer human, but these guys are the real deal. And so she's kind of our in between the human world and the fairy world herself. um, and that also kind of comes from some personal preferences. I've always liked characters like that, um, who are very relatable, very human like, but have a little bit more to them than meets the eye. And that comes from human mages, or people who can talk to animals, or frankly just even like what I would describe as practical magic. People who know how to live in the woods. I've got some friends who like go into the forest and find edible roots and mushrooms and survive, and I find that amazing. I wish I was like that. But
Sounds hard.
yeah, yeah, it's really hard, and it's definitely a skill, and you have to study it. And so
Oh,
um,
you would love. There's a show that my wife has discovered called Alone. Have you heard of this one?
I haven't.
It's on, I believe, the History Channel. But it's not. I think it's only got 4 seasons.
Hmm.
Maybe I think it's the History Channel. But anyway, it's a reality show, but it's like what you wanted Survivor to be. So they take 12 people. They're given a walkie-talkie. They're allowed to bring like enough as much stuff as they can fit in a backpack, I think, and they are
Hmm.
dropped in the middle of the Canadian wilderness. And whoever lasts the longest wins. But the thing
Wow.
is, they're not allowed, they can't talk to anybody. Like once every week, I think, somebody from the show comes in to do a weight check to make sure that they're still healthy enough to stay out there.
Right.
Um,
That's good.
and once they're done, they pick up their walkie-talkie and they say, "I'm done. Come get me." And it lasts as, and you don't know how many people are left when you do that. Like
Right.
they don't tell you anything, and so you're literally just living out in the woods until the show shows up and says, "Hey, you won."
Wow. That
And
does sound fascinating and
it's
kind of terrifying
intense.
at the same time.
I,
Yeah,
I
I grew
think
up I grew up backpacking, and something my dad always impressed on us was how bad it would be to get lost. I think that was also because it was his fear was
mm.
something happening to any of us. And
Yeah.
uh, we would go out in the middle of nowhere and be in tents in the woods, and that actually still has a very strong magic for me. I haven't been camping in a really long time, um, but it's even in my bio at the back of the book. Some of the first fairy tales I ever heard were hiking along, bored because it's 4 miles to wherever it is we're going. When you're a kid, that's a really long way. And my mom would and I would make stories up out of the roots that we would see from the trees coming down these embankments, and the fairies that lived there and what they would do. And so that the woods and the forest are very mythical to me in many ways. So
All right. So, how many drafts did you end up doing before you self-published?
for Shifted, boy, I struggle with this question. I've been trying to think of the best way to answer it, since you sent your outline. I am very lucky in that I've historically never not had to do very many rewrites. Um, and I think that might also be just a factor of having taken so long on my first novel and rewritten it so many times. I have kind of an averse reaction now to to doing that. So, obviously edits that come from my beta readers, edits that come from my sister who does the full book, and then edits that come from my agent are each kind of their own stage, but it's more like edits as opposed to first draft, second draft. The book I'm working on right now is the first one where I would describe what I'm doing as a rewrite. And even then, I'm pulling very heavily from what I've already written, whole sections and chapters, and just kind of reworking some plot holes and some character development as I go along. Um, so in that regard, I would argue that Shifted really only had the first draft that I then tweaked and tweezed. But in terms of like, if you want to consider each stage a different draft, probably three. The first draft that I wrote, then, obviously I went through edits and discussions with my twin, and we fought some things out and clarified a few things. And then once my agent read it and he gave me some thoughts and ideas and asked me to trim it down and get more specific in certain areas, that would probably be the second draft. So I guess only two really. Um, Two stages, three drafts. Uh, would probably be the fairest way to put it. I know that some people when they do a draft, it's really like writing the book over again. Um, and I am grateful for myself that that's not how I work. I think I'd probably go a little nuts, or I would get dragged back down into the constant rewrite phase. And I really want to avoid that as much as possible. Just because from my own writing, uh, my writing doesn't necessarily improve all that much from draft to draft. The ideas may get clearer. I may, fill out some plot holes or some lampshade issues. And I would definitely say that, especially after my beta readers and my editor and my agent have worked on a book, it is a much stronger book. Um, but I wouldn't necessarily say that it's structurally different than it used to be. With the exception probably of the one that I'm working on right now, like I said, which is probably the lengthiest process I've done. And I think that just has to do with the nature of the book and the story I'm writing. It's more complicated, it's more unique as opposed to based on a particular fairy tale. Um, Even though it is a Sleeping Beauty story, uh, um,
A
and being
sci-fi Sleeping
sci-fi.
Beauty story.
Oh yeah, yeah. I'm
Sounds.
really quite
Hmm,
quite excited about it.
I
And
will ask for details.
well, you can at the end if you want. I'm not too worried about it. People stealing my thoughts. But it's more complicated, and it took me out of my comfort zone a little bit, because the historical fairy tale is what I would call my comfort zone. It's, if I'm gonna make a claim to being good at something, it's what I'm good at. Um, and the sci-fi really pushed me. Um, Trying to figure out, there were some pretty, I would say, embarrassing plot holes that my agent found, which, obviously he didn't judge me for it or think, oh my gosh, this girl doesn't know what she's talking about. But it was just stuff I hadn't anticipated. So he has such an enormous perspective from the years he's been working in the field with different authors and uh, titans, I would say. And so his opinions and questions that he makes me answer, and edits that he gives me are just enormously valuable. Um, but I've been, like I said, I've been very lucky that it hasn't ever been an excruciating process. Um, I'd say I probably spend about a year writing a book, and then, 8 months writing a book, and then 3 months editing it. If things go well, and that's been the case to date. This latest book, I'm in the second year working on it, which has been a little bit difficult because I've still got it in my head that I need to be writing a book a year, but it's going to be worth it, and a much better story for taking that time. So I ultimately don't regret it at all.
What were some of the biggest revisions that had to be made with Shifted?
Um, for Shifted, let me see. There were some when I was reading it, I was like, oh yeah, I forgot I'd done that. Um, Shifted, luckily, kind of stayed pretty close to what it originally was. Some of my other books have had larger and more significant revisions. Um, I would say that the the bones of Shifted are pretty similar. If you were to read the first draft compared to the book that's available for purchase, it's pretty close. Um, but some of the things that changed were the tragedies that happen at the beginning. Um, in the first draft, Robin was absolutely to blame for those. They were his continued vengeance against the town. And my agent thought that it made more sense, and it was also more in keeping with the other versions of the fairy tale, that those are tragedies of life um, that happen to push the main character towards this ultimate adventure, as opposed to giving Robin more things to be blamed for. Also, it kind of it didn't really work in terms of, Robin's last curse was supposed to be the curse, on turning the girl into a beast and trapping her in the manor. So if he's still coming back and tormenting the town, that doesn't hold up. Obviously, he's still causing more mischief, but he's supposed to be this broken thing, you know, lurking on the edges of his final work. Um, and so the tragedies that occurred at the beginning, those became just the sometimes the tough things that happen in life, as opposed to fairy work. And I think that it holds up. I it we needed that push to get Lewis, you know, to go to the manor and kind of have everything taken away. That's a part of the fairy tale, or at least the fairy tales that I've always really enjoyed have that aspect to them. Um, and it's real. Life's hard, and sometimes really terrible things happen, and we have to go on regardless. Um, that was probably one of the big things at the very start. Let me see.
From a
Kind of
from a
flipping
reader
through.
perspective, another thing that change helped is if Robin is responsible for, because like all of those bad things all affected Lewis, and if Robin's
Yeah.
responsible for it, then as a reader, I would want Lewis to get some kind of comeuppance on Robin, and
Yeah.
if I was missing out on that, I would feel kind of disappointed.
Yeah, and there was also the question, why Lewis? He wasn't messing with Robin's curse yet. He hadn't attracted his attention yet. And so yeah, there's a very kind of arbitrary, oh, he just happens to be picking on the hero. So there wasn't really any motivation for him to do that.
It's the reverse of plot
Uh,
armor.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Um, so let me see. I'm flipping through like I said, most of the things in the book stayed the same. I did use the phrase "green man" in the book to describe Midas a few times, and interestingly enough, I my agent associates Green Man with the trickster. And so, since Midas was supposed to be a force of justice and good, as opposed to Robin, he thought I should take those words out just in case anybody else got confused. I've always thought of the Green Man as being kind of the justice of the forest, so I'd never heard that perspective before. Um, but one of the things I've learned about editing, my books, I'm always grateful that my agent is very much of the, you're the author, you make the final decision. But it's always good to keep in mind that if one person has a reaction to something, somebody else probably will too. um, and you're never going to please everybody. You're never going to Not everyone's going to like your writing or what you do. But if someone doesn't like something or gets confused by something, it's good to think about. And it did no harm to Midas's ultimate character development to just take those two descriptions out if it was going to cause someone confusion. um, So that was pretty simple edit there. Let me see. The beginning was really the biggest part there. Getting them to um, the town. Let's see. That's honestly all I'm remembering. There might have been bigger things, but like I said, it's been 7 years since this work. Um, so I think that was the biggest one. This one was a pretty easy one. Some of the other books we worked on have been much harder. There's a book I wrote, which was a Red Riding Hood story, which was set in 13th century Russia. Um, that
There are many wolves there.
There are many wolves there. Yeah, that was a fun one, but that one required quite a bit of rewriting,
Mm.
um, and a lot of work. And it was a darker story. Probably of all the books I've written, it was the weirdest. I have yet to reread it from like enough time has gone by I can just read it as a reader as opposed to a writer. But it's on my list of things to do and see what I feel about it. It's always delightful to go back to something you've written and enjoy it as opposed to like, oh man, I could have fixed that paragraph, or why did I there's two words that are the same in this sentence. That's not good.
Oh, I hate it when I do that.
There was a little bit of that and shifted, but only a couple places. So ultimately, I was pretty pleased. I was able to go back to it.
So one thing that I struggle with sometimes, and I hear that a lot of writers, you kind of agonize over it at times, is how hard were any of the characters' names difficult to pick?
Um, Not really. I usually name my characters pretty early on in the planning process. Um, and frankly, a really fantastic resource. There's a website called Nimbler, Nymbler. If you Googled it, I'm sure it would come up. It's a baby naming website. And what I like about it is that you can put in a name like Sarah, and it will give you male names that are similar. It'll give you female names that are similar. It'll tell you what time period they're from, what culture they're from. You can pick, like, if for this book, I was like, I want to find male and female names that are kind of Irish, without being something that's got a B, an H, and a T in a row. Um, uh, and
Because
you
that's
can
just
I
not
I
readable.
also yeah, it's not readable. So you can also I would also Google Irish names, German names, and get lists and just kind of go through and find meanings that were related to the character. I did that quite heavily with my Russian book, because I wanted to find character names that were pronounceable, but also kind of went together with who the characters were. Um, so yeah, naming the characters hasn't to date been a problem. I also try to pull from the fairy tales um, as much as possible. Lewis actually comes from where did Lewis come from? Well, one of the original fairy tales is French, um, and Louis, is has a lot of French origins there, um, and Robin obviously, comes from the Robin Goodfellow character. So um, those are pretty easy, and yeah, that's never been something I truly struggled with. In my fantasy novel, absolutely, because I kept trying to give people magnificent multisyllabic names that sounded fantastical, and I feel like that's just a road to nowhere after a certain point. And the more recent iterations of that fantasy novel, the names started getting more normal. So I went to the extreme and then came back. So yeah, it's we can't all be as amazing as Tolkien and make up our own language and the names that then there come out of it. Which boy, it still boggles my mind that he was able to do that. Talk about a genius.
takes too long. I want to publish my novel this year.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, the naming was pretty simple for the most part, I think.
So did you want Lewis to have a French sounding name just because of the La Belle and La Belle?
That was how it started. I don't really think of Louis as a French name myself, but the origins are French, and so that's kind of where I went when I was looking for a name for him. The book I'm working on right now is, being a Sleeping Beauty story. The main character is Charles, which is, a nod to Prince Charming. Um, and also uh, one of there's actually two versions of Sleeping Beauty original fairy tales, and the author of one is a Charles something. So that's kind of where that came from as well. Um, so I usually only put like deep meaning and allusions to the fairy tales in like the main characters. The side characters, it's really just a matter of what culture am I writing from the perspective of, what country, what time period, what was popular at the time, what sounds good, and what won't be a roadblock to my readers. There have been, I'm trying to remember now which book it was. I guess it doesn't really matter, but there have been a couple of times where I named a character with a name from the time that is also popular now. And my beta readers were like, I know what you're doing, but it's confusing because I'm thinking of that as a modern name when you're in the 1600s. So you might consider changing it. Um, and that's a good thing to keep in mind too, I think.
That's
That,
gonna be hard soon because a lot of the older names are starting to come back, like
yeah,
Isabella and Sophia and
yeah,
Eleanor. My
yeah.
daughter's name is Charlotte.
Awesome. That's a great name. I love that
I
name.
think so. We call her Charlie, but
Oh, that's so cute.
she is. I like her. So I was going to ask you about the reason why the chapters counted down, but you already answered
Oh,
that.
yeah. Cool. Cool.
uh, so uh, so I did want to point. So I actually thought for a little while, once I realized that it was in the real world, I
Mhm.
thought that it might take place in Australia because you referred to the frozen South in the first chapter. Just,
Oh,
just
interesting.
found that funny.
That's really neat. I haven't gotten that comment before, and I find that fascinating. That's super fun. So yeah,
But I was like,
cool.
oh, she's just talking about the fact that people were exploring Antarctica at the time. All
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, and that took some research because immediately your mind goes to the frozen north, but that wasn't being explored at the time,
Mhm.
like Antarctic was. So yeah, that was just a little. I don't even remember why. I think that just came from research of what explorations were occurring at this time period,
Yeah.
and the South was the biggest one that might have gained attention. Uh, so uh, so yeah,
My mind also went
Australia.
to a weird place just because I pointed out on Facebook several months ago. I was like, why is it that all fantasy novels that take place in these worlds always have the frozen north? Why is it never reversed and the south is really cold?
Yeah, you think, I mean, it would be both, feasibly with a polar um, setup, but I guess, you could have a tropical South Pole and a frozen North Pole, depending physics. I don't know exactly how that would work in terms of astronomical science, but uh, that's a good thing to keep in mind for future novels.
So with chapter 12, so I wanted to ask, have you read Terry Brooks's Running with the Demon?
I haven't. I don't.
Okay,
I haven't
because
read. I don't know that I've read any Terry Brooks. I always immediately my mind always actually thinks Terry Pratchett, who I have read. And then I have to remember no Brooks, different last name. I don't think I've ever read any of Terry Brooks's works.
his are pretty fascinating. I'd like to interview
Yeah.
him. His thing is his first thing was the Sword of Shannara or the Shannara series.
Oh, I've heard of those. Yes.
Yeah. So his is a fantasy world with elves and orcs and goblins, but you find out as the novel goes along. It's not really spoiling anything. The book came out like '78, so everybody most people
Yeah, I don't mind.
most people know it. You find out that it's actually a post apocalyptic world. So like there
Wow.
was some kind of horrible thing that happened to the world, and it irradiated people, and so all of these elves and ogres and trolls and stuff are actually descendants of mutations that happened in humanity. So like, and like some of the first hints you get
Wow.
about it is like they're walking through these ruins, and he describes the Space Needle essentially fallen over, and so you're like, wait, this is in North America? What?
Wow,
But
that's fantastic.
but so he came out with a couple of prequel series after many years that are like, okay, this is what happened. And the first one was called Running with the Demon, and there's a conversation between two characters that reminded me a lot that your conversation between Eyeless and Robin the first time actually reminded me of a lot. Like even the relationship between the two characters was very similar. It was odd.
Weird. Yeah, I guess that goes back to the there's nothing new under the sun type thing. And it's always a little bit disturbing if from a writer perspective if I'm reading a book that I read a long time ago and I
Hmm.
recognize something in it from my writing. I'm like, "Oh, did I rip that off in my subconscious or did this is this just a coincidence?" And then, obviously with books you've never read before, um uh, obviously there's no way you could know, but uh, it's I guess it could also be kind of gratifying, to see have it. Well, I always find it gratifying when anybody compares my books to something else they've read, especially if that person is published. Hey, because it gives me hope that I'm actually on the right track to something. Um, but yeah, that's I've heard the names of those books many times. I know many people who've read them, so I really should probably give them a go at some point. Add them to the stack.
I have
That's
I've not read any of the actual Shannara series, because I have this weird psychological thing that even if it's in a different publication order, I have to read in chronological order. So
oh
I
yeah,
started on the prequel series, and so far I'm not actually into the fantasy world yet.
ha yeah yeah.
I hope you enjoyed this broad overview of Shifted with Caitlyn Mitchell, and in the next part, we will finally delve into the actual book as it currently exists by digging into her writing decisions chapter by chapter. If you want to support Miss Mitchell and her storytelling, it's as simple as purchasing her books. Shifted and The Roaring Boys are both available on Amazon right now. If you'd like to support this podcast, please subscribe to it on your preferred podcast deliverer. Rate it, share it with your friends, and you can also become a patron on patreon.com/thinkingtoinking. If you're a writer of a published or self-published book or a viewable film or play who would like to appear on this podcast, you can email me at thinktoinkpodcast@gmail.com, and we will see you next time. From Thinking to Inking is a bookworm podcast from Corticate Entertainment. Theme music is an original composition by and property of Hannah Ausband Scheidt. She may be contacted at hannahausbandscheidt.com, HANNAHAUSBAND